Welcome to Calvary Conversations, a ministry of Calvary University. Today we have a great discussion on the Barna Report on the state of the church, a report that was released at the end of 2021, and you can find a link to that report in the comments below. My guests today are Sean LePage, who is the chair and associate professor of ministry studies at Calvary University, and also the pastor of City Church in Lawrence, Kansas. We also have Jeremy Schell, who is an adjunct teacher at Calvary University and the production pastor at Graceway Church in Kansas City. We also have Mike Dodds, who is the head or director of CU Press and is a professor of ministry studies at Calvary University as well. Guys, I'm really pleased to have you with us today, and am really looking forward to discussing this article with you all. The first question that Barna asks in this article is regarding how adults feel after worship services. And the first item that's reported on here is that 2/3 of church adults feel encouraged. And if we want to get at the exact wording here, there's 78% feel encouraged of practicing Christians anyway, after church services, inspired most of the time. That's 70% of practicing Christians. 82% feel encouraged, 78% feel inspired, 77% feel forgiven after church attendance. So the question I have for you, Sean, just right up front is this good news? Like, how do you interpret these findings?
Wow, yeah. Well, obviously, the Bible tells us to encourage one another, and to be inspired is I mean, that should go with the territory of being a Christian. We should be the most inspired and inspirational people on the planet. And of course, forgiveness is at the heart of what we believe. The question for me, though, is exactly why people feel a certain way. You know, people can feel encouraged for lots of reasons. People can feel inspired, whether they're Christian or not. And you know, what is the basis of their feelings of forgiveness? So you know, I mean, I think it's positive. You know, like, I think if we were if this survey was done, you know, maybe 20-25 years ago, a lot of people, I think, would probably have responded that they you know, didn't have such great feelings about their church. I don't know, just various attitudes towards the church and whatever. I think there was at least a stereotype that churches loaded up people with guilt and you know, were boring and whatever. I don't know. Maybe that was purely stereotype. I didn't feel those feelings myself at the time, but regardless, you know, I want more information, basically. Like, why do people feel encouraged and inspired and forgiven? So, for example, another Barna article that I found basically says that most adults feel, there's that word, feelings. Most adults feel accepted by God, but lack a biblical worldview. You know, the gist of it is that, you know, the feelings didn't reflect truth. They didn't affect or reflect that the responders to the survey, you know, really understood why they should be encouraged and why they should be inspired and forgiven. You know, people can have certain feelings, say, of being forgiven, but in reality, not be clear about you know, kind of the basis of forgiveness, which includes, you know, agreement with God. So, like, you look at a passage like 1 John 1:9 that says, if we confess our sin, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sin. That word confess means to agree with God that what we're doing is sin, and he's faithful. He'll forgive us for sure. But there's a condition there that we must agree with him that such and such behavior, lifestyle, whatever is actually sin. That's a condition for receiving forgiveness. So it's possible, that these feelings of forgiveness are not rooted in biblical truth. That's my concern.
Jeremy, do you have any thoughts on this? I know that, being responsible for worship music, that's often really considered in the realm of emotion. And
Yeah.
as we look at these thoughts about, feeling inspired, feeling forgiven, do you have any thoughts about what your observations are about the emotional connection and the reality or the truth of God's word as it's presented in church?
Yeah, I mean, the idea, the thought of people being inspired is encouraging to me in the sense that, yeah, I agree with what Sean said, that we do want people to feel that. We want them to feel like they've been inspired. I do wonder how deep that runs, right? Is it merely a Sunday inspiration, and then by Monday morning I've lost that inspiration, and I'm, and the rest of the week I spend on this downward slope until, which to me doesn't sound good, right? I would ideally hope that, the song of that Sunday morning, whatever that would be, is something that you can carry with you throughout the week. I was a little surprised by the word forgiven. I thought it's unique. It's unique and interesting that that's the other word that popped up in the report, because I thought either, hey, are we, is that regularly emphasized in the American church, right? The fact of forgiveness, because I feel like people struggle with that. I feel like what we were saying, that we maybe don't understand the root of it, in the sense that, I know people that struggle that, I can't forgive my neighbor, I can't forgive my family, whatever. And so the idea of maybe saying, oh, all these churchgoers feel forgiven, and yet I see how we treat each other, would be concerning.
Right.
So I feel like it's an interesting thing, that in the sense of, when we're programming worship, yeah, definitely, I want to see people inspired, and see people participate, and feel like, through song, I can both express things to God, and express things to the people I'm with. But then forgiven was just to me, just a little bit of a curveball in the article. Like, oh, that's the other word we went with,
I had a bit of a reaction to that myself. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, you can say 70, is it 77?
Yeah.
77% of practicing Christians feel forgiven. But the reality of the gospel of Jesus Christ is that we are forgiven through his sacrifice on the cross.
Yeah.
It's a reality that we accept. I have a little bit of a concern about feeling forgiven. It seems like, on the one hand, uh, I have concerns that you would have 23% of Christians who don't feel forgiven.
Right.
It seems like they haven't embraced that reality regardless of their feeling. And then I would also have concerns about non-practicing Christians or just other churchgoers feeling forgiven when indeed they have not received the gift of Christ and his work on the cross. They've not embraced that. To as many as received him, to them he gave the power to be called the sons of God. So I don't know, any comments on that, Mike? As we're talking about forgiveness here.
Yeah, I wanted to jump in. I'm wondering how broad the survey was. I was a chaplain in the Air Force, and so saw the diversity of the Protestant question. You were either a Catholic or a Protestant chaplain, and so we had the whole diversity of people there. And going in from my own denominational background, and then seeing other people, and knowing there are other traditions that pronounce forgiveness, and they actually have that as a part of the liturgy, part of their worship activity. Maybe that's part of it. But I think there's also that expectation when I go to church. There's I want to connect with God, and I'm dealing with issues in life, and so it might be a personal expression that people have there. But I was thinking that denominational question that people would have, did the service communicate that to me? That's one side, but also I wanted to unload some guilt, and that's why I come to God. That might be it too.
Yeah, yeah. The next part of the survey has to do with disappointment, and so the cogent part of this deals with uh, um, people feeling disappointed. Let's see, it was 7% or of practicing Christians. 8% of church adults feel disappointed with the church service, and I'm reacting a little bit to this, honestly, just wearing this out, in the open here, uh, because I think there are some reasons that are very legitimate in terms of feeling disappointed after a church service, and there are some reasons that are not at all. And I know that we tend to gravitate toward a very consumerist culture when it comes to church. So I'm curious your thoughts, Mike, on that. When do you think it's valid to be disappointed, or what kinds of disappointments do you think are valid with respect to church, and what are not so valid?
Yeah, people come to church with good expectations, appropriate, some inappropriate. All right, we understand that, but I've seen through the years that we expect the church to be perfect, and that's sort of a good thing. We expect God to communicate and relate to us in perfect ways, but that's a high expectation. Some of these questions here, I wish the report would say more. What do they mean, feel guilty? About what? Disappointed? About what? Your expectations met? About what? All right, so there was a lot missing from the report. But I do know that people come to church, expecting to hear hope, just an expectation of, if there's a God and he's all powerful, can't he do something for me if he loves me? So there's a hope in what we hear. There's an expectation of the people. I've concluded that probably some of the deepest disappointments we'll have is with other Christians in life. Now, family for sure, but because we're expecting them to be perfect. But we come imperfect and they come imperfect too. And so there's some disappointment, maybe with the people, maybe with the expectation for finding friends, and that's a good expectation about church. We talked about fellowship. Sean, you mentioned that we want to encourage one another. We come with that expectation. So I wish it would have said a little bit more in some areas of detail there. And I'm thinking with my pastor hat on here. But how to address those expectations, and that comes through the sermon, that comes through the relationships, that comes through how you talk, and I'm thinking of the leaders in the church, and how, so people can temper their expectations. It's interesting. I had a lady in one church. She got up as a sharing evening one evening, and she says, I really like coming to this church, and I like new churches, but then I find out what people are like, and I want to go to another church. Right. So I mean, we all laughed with her, but we knew the reality of it, and so we've got to find reality. And it's as one person said, one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. And so that's we got to, as you said, or Tim earlier, we have to temper and understand what's a biblical expectation when we come to church. And then you get into worship and the sermon and all those expectations that go along with it, that you need to have some reality.
Jeremy, I can imagine that you often experience people seem to be have a lot of high opinions about, or strong opinions about, what worship music should be and should not be. And I'm sure you catch the brunt of a lot of that discussion. Can you talk a little bit about that disappointment?
Yeah, I know. It's always, I always think about, like, who's going to come up to you today and be like, if you would have just sang this song, or frankly in this style, and you're like, oh, it's where you have to think like, I literally, if you did a Sunday for every group, I don't know if we'd even make it through every set of people, right? Okay, just for the hymn people and just for the liturgical people. So yeah, and I thought about this too, thinking about, when you work at a church, sometimes it's hard to grasp this question, because we oftentimes understand the reasons why. But I think about, like, when I talk to people is sometimes who say, well, I was disappointed because maybe the lead pastor didn't speak today, or I was disappointed. And Mike, you hit on a couple of really high points that we hear, I didn't connect with someone today, or I felt like people weren't friendly. It's one thing we've done at our church, like, as we survey sometimes our first time guests, like, tell us about your experience, and you hate it when someone says, yeah, well, nobody greeted me. And so, oh, that's a huge myth, because ideally we ought to be the most friendly place on the planet. It's like, ideally the church ought to be the one place where you feel like we're glad you're here. But yeah, in the worship world, it's hilarious and really can be disheartening at the same time sometimes, because you think, we've worked really hard, and you're like, yeah, I didn't like it. But I think too, for those, for preaching pastors, I'm assuming you feel the same way, right? Like, I prepped really hard on that sermon, and everyone was like, yeah, pastor, it really didn't hit the mark. So
yeah. Well, we have one more question I'd like to get to, and Jeremy, this is actually starting with you.
Yeah.
Again, this deals with personally experiencing the presence of God. As we look at the Barna report, it says that the majority of both practicing Christians, 77%, and church adults, 62%, say that they feel as if they have connected with God or personally experienced the presence of God most of the time or frequently following a church service. As we talk about this language of experiencing the presence of God, there are certain denominations that probably emphasize that more. There are certain denominations that perhaps view the experience of church as more of a cerebral or knowledge gathering sort of function. I'm curious what your reaction, Jeremy, is to this. I know that people put a lot of pressure on the worship leader to do things like lead us into the presence of God or lead us to the throne, and they use a lot of language like that. And I'd be really interested in your response to this, the findings of this article.
Yeah, there's some that it can be both at the surface. Oh, this is encouraging, right? I feel like we're doing a good job. Okay. At the same time, I would love to know the context of the question, right? Is that evaluating the whole service? Because, especially when I've programmed worship before, for me, that's a piece of it is, and one of the things, like, I even work with our students on is worship doesn't stop when the praise team leaves the stage, right? It's an entire service, right? So my goal would be that whether you're giving announcements or you're praying or you're preaching, all of that ought to be worshipful. All of it ought to have that spirit of worship, versus it being the only time we're experiencing God's presence is in the music. Well, that can't be, because then do we not experience God's presence in prayer or in the preaching of his word? And I think there have been moments where, in the middle of a sermon, you feel like you're on holy ground, because either the Spirit is convicting me of something that I'm hearing, or even the broader congregation, is sometimes we have to be reminded as a church of where our failures and misgivings are. I do think it's important for worship leaders and pastors to emphasize people worshiping in spirit and in truth, right? Understanding that it should be both. I think we should enjoy the feeling of singing and praising, but there should be something cerebral to that, right? We should be also applying the biblical knowledge that we have and the truth of God's word into what we do in worship, versus it just being, I had a good feeling, because that's right. Going to last you till about the afternoon, or maybe Monday morning, when you're like, yeah, now I don't have that feeling anymore.
or maybe not quite to the end of the Chiefs game.
Yeah.
Let's not go there.
Yeah, no, I think the pain still.
It's interesting. The later in the Barna report, it talks about, did you feel like it was the most important experience of the week or something like that? One of the questions. What does that mean? Again, I'd like to know a little bit more. When you think of worship, it has to be a whole person thing. Jeremy, you focused on what seems to be a false view that worship only has to do with the music, because there's that emotional element. But yet you also mentioned that it has to be whole person. There has to be that cognitive. I need to connect with truth. It's interesting that Paul in Romans 12 says, we give our spiritual service of worship. It's usually translated, it's service. And then he goes on and says, be transformed by the renewing of your mind. But Paul also says, when I preach, I want it to be not just the mind, the cognitive. I want spirit and power. I mean, God moves. So it's whole person. It's the mind. It's the emotions. But then we need to connect with the will. And that's what I was thinking of that question where he said, do I feel that I want to challenge to change? That was the next question in that area. And yeah, we should be challenged. So it's a whole person thing. And we need to help people to see that.
Sean, I'll let you close us out with any thoughts you would have on, as a pastor, on leading the congregation into an experience with God, what that looks like, and your response to the Barna report on this. Yeah,
I really enjoyed hearing your perspectives, and I think I would like to use this as a discussion tool. So I think it would be great to sit down with members of our churches and just look at these responses to this survey and just get people's input,
right.
Then talk with talk about the legitimacy of feelings. I mean, feelings are feelings. That's not, there's nothing wrong or right about having feelings about something, but I think you could also dig down a little deeper and find out, try to figure out why do you have those feelings? Why do you leave our worship service feeling guilty, or whatever? I think this would just be a great discussion tool, with members of the church, as well as I think this would be a great thing for the staff of a church or the leadership of a church to work through and really try to figure out, try to really assess how you're doing, like, for example, what are we trying to accomplish with a worship service? What's the point? What's the goal? Like that quote that I was frantically searching for earlier is that most born-again Christians hold a confusing and inherently contradictory set of religious beliefs that go unchecked by the leaders and teachers of their faith community. So wow, I mean, I can really see myself using this survey as a conversation tool to really help people, assess whether their religious beliefs are contradictory, and if so, I mean, all of us probably have contradictory beliefs, but if that's so, then what should we do about it? And how can the leaders and teachers of this faith community help you to really develop a biblical worldview? And how might that impact your feelings about church services? So those are my thoughts.
Yep. Well, hey guys, thank you so much for joining us today, Jeremy and Sean and Mike. It has been a pleasure, and I encourage our listeners to read this Barna report. Use it. I think, Sean, you ended on a great tone there. Use it as a discussion starter with your fellow church members, even with your church leadership, and see what the Lord does through those discussions. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Calvary Conversations, a service of Calvary University in Kansas City, Missouri. We invite you to participate in the conversation by contacting us through the Calvary University website, calvary.edu, or by calling us at 888-322-0110. Join us again next week for another Calvary Conversation.